I'm Rebecca Brackman. I'm an associate professor of English, and we were asked if we had some research that we'd done that might be somewhat interesting to a general audience, that we could present it at homecoming, give a chance for alums to see what faculty at your school are up to these days. So this is a piece that I've presented at a conference for people who study early medieval England. And it is very much a crossover piece, as you'll see. It brings together a lot of different threads and different areas of study. Frank asked me to say that I will certainly take questions at the end. I'm not planning to go for an entire hour, don't worry. If you don't have a good mic or you don't want to talk, but you do have a question that you think of as I'm reading, go ahead and type it into the chat, and Frank will be monitoring that, and I will look through those and answer those at the end. So give me a moment to share my screen. I do have a PowerPoint. All right, can everyone see the PowerPoint? Mm-hmm. Great. And as I mentioned, I'm in the field of English, and it is actually the standard in our discipline to read our papers and our arguments to our audience. So that is what I'm going to be doing, along with my slides. My talk today brings together work from quite a few different fields of study: medicine, psychology, botany, anthropology, and medieval literature, to consider what our modern insight into the placebo effect can offer us as we try to understand early medieval English medicine. That might sound like a pretty specialized subject, but in fact, gathering all these ideas in a conversation has a lot to tell us about how sickness, healing, and bodies were imagined in the past, and maybe has a little to tell us about ourselves too. I focus on two medical texts written in England. Hang on, my slides are not advancing. There we go. Written in England in the 10th and 11th centuries. The Leech books, which are a series of medical prescriptions and instructions for doctors to treat their patients, and the Old English Herbal, which lists dozens of plants and their medicinal uses. Both of these are written in a language we now refer to as Old English, which was spoken and written in southern Britain from about 500 to 1100 CE. These are the oldest vernacular, that is not Greek or Latin, medical writings in all of Western medicine. And a few years ago, a study showed that many of the plant-based remedies have therapeutic chemical properties that can be demonstrated in modern laboratory analysis. Many of them don't, however, and most articles about these texts at some point say, of course, a lot of these treatments wouldn't have worked. They were just a placebo. As I kept seeing this, I said to myself, hang on though, isn't the placebo effect real? I mean, if it weren't, we wouldn't have to test against it when new drugs are investigated. I started to look at what we now know about the placebo effect, and what I found has led me to a conclusion quite the opposite of what most previous scholars have argued. Understanding the placebo effect shows that many of these remedies would have worked, and also gives us an idea of how medical treatment fit into wider cultural beliefs and practices in early medieval England. The placebo effect, simply put, the biological capability to activate the body's own healing functions by a meaningful interaction with another person or agent, is incredibly powerful. So first, we have to get over any notion that placebo means it doesn't really work, but instead consider how it does work. Most modern studies agree there are two major mechanisms involved: conditioning and expectancy. Conditioning happens when something chemically active is paired with something inactive, but with a strong sensory component. The body's response gets tied to the sensory component and happens even without the active element. Good old Pavlov getting his dog to salivate by ringing a bell. This could have happened in early medieval medical practice, but today I'm going to focus primarily on expectancy, which is based on information and beliefs rather than sensory perception. I want to further distinguish between two types of expectancy. I'm going to call conscious expectancy any beliefs we have about sickness and medicine that we're aware of, which come about from direct experience or from communications with friends and doctors. Unconscious expectancy comes from beliefs about treatments or illnesses that we don't even realize we have. The medical anthropologist Daniel Moorman calls both of these meaning, and he even goes so far as to rename the placebo effect the meaning response, arguing that these beliefs, both conscious and not, affect not just placebos, but even chemically active therapies. Now, not all medical researchers agree with his terminology, but for my case, I think focusing on meaning and culture is a very useful approach. So I'll use both placebo effect and meaning response in this paper. Most studies of conscious expectancy involve the passing of information, particularly false information, and examining the result. For instance, so-called deceptive trials, in which subjects are told that they will receive an active substance like caffeine, show a higher rate of placebo response than trials where subjects are told that they might receive the substance, even when both trials involve only inert agents. Nobody, in fact, ever got any caffeine. This higher rate is attributed to expectancy. People expect to get the jitters, so they do. One powerful creator of conscious expectancy is social reinforcement. If your friend on Facebook writes, "I've tried lots of vitamin C and zinc cold remedies, and I think airborne chewables really work," then you are more likely to also receive real, measurable relief from your cold symptoms should you seek out airborne chewables the next time a virus sweeps your community. Now, there's no evidence for or against this type of peer reinforcement with regard to early medieval English patients, although we can speculate that a satisfied patient would mention his or her experience to friends and family just like we do. There's just no records. While peer reinforcement of expectancy is potent, equally or more powerful is verbal reinforcement from a physician. As one clinical therapeutics article states, quote, "Positively influencing patients' belief about therapeutic success is one way to maximize the placebo effect." The physician's role in expectancy-based response can explain some textual oddities in the Old English medical texts. A common element in the Old English herbal and in the Leech books are efficacy statements, asserting the value of the remedy. Nearly every entry in the herbal contains such a statement at the end. And as I go through these, normally when you present on a dead language, you don't read the quote in the original language, you just read the translation. For today, I'd like to give you a chance to hear a little bit of Old English. So for these first few, I will read the Old English and the translation, and then subsequently I'll just go with the translation. To take just a few examples, Remedy 46.1 on Horehound to treat a head cold exclaims, "Heohina yahalat wonderliche." It will help wonderfully. OEH 14.1 on Doc for swellings in the groin enthuses that this is cellest with Kiernu. This is the best for those swellings. Similar statements appear in the Leech books. That beats sweet a good cell. That is a very good cell. This beats the besta lacidum. This is the best remedy. And sona bit cell. Soon it is well. These statements appear at first to be entirely redundant. After all, surely the supposition of the medical texts are that their remedies work. Otherwise, why write them? Nonetheless, the Old English medical texts assert repeatedly that the patient will improve or that salves and drinks are good medicine. Also relevant, I think, in this regard is a curious tick of the Leech books, a tendency to switch from telling the doctor what to do to seemingly addressing the patient, switching pronouns from he to you to describe the person seeking treatment. For instance, if wakefulness be with a man, press poppy, rub in oil, smear your face with it and whole body, the wakefulness will be alleviated wonderfully quickly. Oswald Cockayne, the first translator of these manuscripts, periodically felt impelled to protest in his translations that the change of pronouns is an error of the text. I propose that such shifts are not an error. Anne van Arsdale has persuasively argued that the instructions in early medieval medical texts are only shorthand, reminders for practitioners who already possess the relevant skill sets. It's not really a textbook. It's more like a recipe card from your grandmother. The Old English medical texts offer concise schematic information about what to do. I suggest that the periodic shift to second-person pronouns to you indicates that the remedies also at times remind the physician not just what to do, but what to say. If instructions for verbal components are part of what the leechdoms convey to doctors, then efficacy statements would serve as periodic reminders to tell the patient that the remedy will work. These comments are part of the treatment. Such statements made by one's physician have profound effects on patients' response to therapies. The stylistic anomalies of efficacy statements and pronoun shifts suggest early medieval English doctors behaved in ways that would augment their patients' meaning response to treatment by heightening their expectancy, exactly as modern clinical physicians are now being encouraged to do. Conscious expectancy accounts for placebo effect in many cases. However, unconsciously held cultural beliefs can affect bodily responses as well, even for those treatments which do involve chemically active agents. Humans respond to pharmacologically active agents, human response to active agents varies widely among cultures. Meaning makes medicine in bodies, regardless of what happens in the lab. The method used to administer a treatment seems to be a crucial factor in how we react. Several researchers have found that whether the remedy is active or inert, shots work better than pills do for most American patients. Even when dosages are the same and there's no fundamental biological reason why the injected medicine would transmit more effectively. Placebo surgery seems to have an even higher rate, at times over 75%, of evoking a meaning response that results in cessation of pain. In short, treatment modalities matter. Mormon lists several unconscious assumptions of modern patients that manifest in some clinically observed meaning responses. We know that shots are more powerful than pills. We know that drugs, which have to be stored in the refrigerator, are more powerful than ones that can be kept in the medicine cabinet. We know that big, multicolored capsules are more powerful than white aspirin-sized tablets. We know that very tiny pills, which must be small because they have very powerful medicine in them, are stronger than aspirin-sized tablets. And it seems that as long as we know these things to be true, we're right. Understanding this can resolve one of the biggest issues in studying early medieval medicine: how to understand so-called magical elements in treatment regimens. Commentators on early medicine have long observed that the original audience would have been unlikely to differentiate between magical and medical, and they've tried to integrate the dual approaches, but few have completely erased any distinction. We still have our modern categories shaping what we look at and how we talk about it. However, remedies calling for incantations, gesture, and placing herbs on one's door or in one's shoe coexist with those requiring ingestion or skin application of herbal concoctions. I argue that these simply reflect a range of meaningful treatment modalities, any of which could provide a somatic healing response. In particular, the Leech Book's prescriptions often call for verbal or kinetic modalities, that is, reciting specific texts or making particular gestures in preparing or administering the remedy. One example of treatment modalities that certainly strike most of us as magic appears in 318, and it's worth quoting in full. For pain in the stomach and abdominal pain, when you see a dung beetle in the ground throwing dirt, grasp him with both hands along with this flung up dirt. Wave your hands vehemently and say 3 times, Remedium facio ad ventris dolorum. Then throw the beetle over your back on the road. Be careful not to look after it. When a man's stomach or abdomen has pain, grasp the stomach with your hands. It will soon be well with him. You can do this for 12 months after you have caught the beetle. I think my favorite thing about that remedy is the expiration date. Particular movements and speech in conjunction with catching the beetle are crucial to this remedy, and this is a treatment that many modern readers would be inclined to view as magical. The text itself makes no such distinction, however. The remedy comes between 2 others with an ingested modality where you drink something. Understanding the placebo effect tells us that if these gestures and words, properly done, were meaningful to the physician and patient, then the patient would probably experience real relief from his or her pain. We need not dismiss such treatment as magical, or maybe even substantially different from botanical interventions. It's simply an alternative modality. By understanding how the variations in treatment mechanism can affect the meaning response, we can appreciate that such remedies would have been highly likely to bring about improvement in the patient's pain levels, as verbal and kinetic modalities seem to have been especially meaningful in early English medicine. In Mormon's terms, they just knew that such strategies worked well, and so they were right. Different illnesses can also have varying meanings across cultures, with a corresponding variation in how well patients respond to intervention. For instance, a study from the 1980s outlined how patients in the USA showed a much more emphatic response in trials to both placebo and active medication for high blood pressure than German patients. In Germany, the medical establishment tended to express more concern about low blood pressure, routinely prescribing medication for patients whose readings would have been considered entirely healthy in the US. In contrast, US patients were regularly warned of the dangers of high blood pressure, the silent killer. So that condition was, and still is, very meaningful to us, and our response to both active and inert treatment reflects this meaning. If we understand the effect of cultural variation in thinking about diseases, we don't have to distinguish between real illness and those caused by elves or devils in medieval medicine. Similarly to how we considered verbal and kinetic elements to be simply available and apparently quite meaningful treatment modalities, the identification of a set of symptoms as fiend sickness or elf shot does not place the ensuing discussion beyond the pale of real medical history. Considering illness as a culturally constituted but somatically real state offers us a way to understand leechdoms that don't pair illnesses and treatments that we regard as magic. Although diseases associated with demonic pathogens often include verbal and kinetic modalities in their treatment, the pairing is by no means exact. I've already discussed the remedy for abdominal pain, which called for the healer to say a Latin charm while holding a dung beetle and then cast the insect over his or her shoulder. The pains in question have no indication that they arise from a supernatural source. It's not an elf disease, it's just a plain tummy ache. The converse arises in Leech Book 367, a series of leechdoms against devil sickness. One of them is entirely botanical. An emetic against the devil. Take a large handful of sedge and gladden, put in a pan, pour on a full bowl of ale, boil away half, rub 20 libcorns, add. This is a good drink against the devil. The remedy is plant-based, even if the plants called for can no longer be confidently identified. This treatment for devils operates with an identical modality to the drinks for jaundice, headaches, and other conditions that we would recognize today. Since the disease was seen as meaningful by the patient and doctor, since diabolical pathogens were an accepted part of illness narrative, then numerous treatment modalities could be and were employed in its treatment. So, what would all of this have ultimately meant for the patient? How much and how often would patients in early medieval England have felt an improvement when they went to see their doctor? Since Henry Beecher's groundbreaking study on placebo analgesia was published in the 1950s, much discussion of placebo effectiveness rates has cited his findings that a placebo response could be expected about 30 to 35% of the time. More recent data has revised this number upward. In a circumstance where the potential for a placebo response comes mostly from conditioning, the number of patients responding positively could be closer to 100%. Other studies have found that the magnitude of socially driven, that is, hearing someone else say that it works, placebo analgesic effects was comparable to direct condition effects. Andrew Greer's reported nearly 50% response to placebo caffeine. Arthur and Elaine Shapiro cite response rates of 50 to 60% for depression, insomnia, and pain. And David Morris states that response to placebo analgesia can range up to nearly 100%, depending on the conditions of the trial. The highest response rates appear not in double-blind trials, where patients know that they might get an inert treatment, something that isn't meaningful to us, but rather in deceptive trials, where patients are told that they are receiving an active agent by an administrator who also believes this to be the case. That circumstance seems closest to that of early medieval medicine, where both doctor and patient believe the remedy will bring about a positive change. Meaning response rates for medieval English patients was probably on the high side. I think we can postulate then that at least half, and possibly even more, of the patients seeking treatment from an early medieval English doctor for many conditions would see discernible bodily improvement from the treatment prescribed, even if none of the ingredients had any chemical effect. What's more, in many cases, the meaning response would have augmented pharmacologically active agents in an herbal remedy. Nor need we eliminate from consideration certain illnesses and therapies on the basis that they are magical, not medical. A robust understanding of how healing and meaning intertwine puts various disease states and treatment modalities within the realm of pathologies and healing. medieval medicine, put simply, worked. Of course, this study's conclusions have application far beyond that of just early medieval England, although I focused on those texts in particular. All early medieval medicine, I argue, can be reevaluated in this light for what it tells us about the interaction of embodied experience of sick and well states, doctors, and medical culture in medieval Europe. Thank you. Were there questions, Frank?
We'll open it up to questions. There weren't questions posted in the chat, but does anybody want to take this opportunity now to ask a question? And if your microphone is on mute, you may need to unmute it or let me know and I can unmute it for you if not.
I can stop sharing too. There.
Any questions? I do have a question. I'll just throw it out there, and I guess I think that was fascinating, and I'm really interested in if I'm understanding correctly in the way that a physician or a practitioner, someone in the context of like that time frame with the Leach book there, what was the moral, or could you talk about the moral or ethical dimension of that, maybe as it was understood to them? I mean, was there a division? I'm sorry.
They thought it worked.
Yeah. Was there, at what point did it become a concept of persuasiveness versus, I think it may work, but I'm going beyond what I actually think is happening, or is that evident at all in the literature?
There's very little other than the remedies themselves. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, we don't really have meta-commentary or journals that would give us insight into what people thought. But what I think we're seeing is that these are intelligent, observant people who are capable of figuring out when something works and sticking with it. Mm-hmm. And we know that anyway, because, and I rapidly mention this, I don't know how familiar any of you are with it. There is a leechdom against a stye, a little staph infection on your eyelid from Bald's Leech book, from the manuscript that I talked about, that when a bunch of people at the University of Nottingham actually made it up, took the ingredients, followed the instructions, and sent it to the lab, it has proven one of the most effective treatments of MRSA of anything we have tried. And it's very specific. I mean, it says you mix it together and you put it in a dish for 9 days. And if you do it for 8 days or 10 days, it's not as good. I mean, it's incredibly precise. And when modern laboratory scientists varied that prescription, it did not work as well. They don't have a scientific method. We're obviously far before the Enlightenment. But they're smart people and they're observant people and they can figure out what works. I think they figured out that telling your patient, hey, this really works well, is part of what works.
Yeah.
So they're, I don't want to say stumbling because that makes them sound undeliberate, but they're embracing practices because they see how well they work. And it turns out that those same practices are now a lot of what modern doctors are being encouraged to do. You remind the patient, hey, I think this is going to work really well. And it will. Any other questions? I'd love to hear feedback, comments.
If somebody happens to be trying to speak and your microphone is on mute, please let me know if you have any. I think you can click a little blue box on your icon and unmute if you need to, or feel free to type the question in the chat.
Oh,
we have some.
Thank you, Tanya.
Okay. You can see the chat window,
I
Dr.
can,
Brackman?
yeah, now
Okay,
that
great.
I'm not sharing, I can see it.
Okay, great. Is there a lesson for us with given that we're in one of the most, I guess, unusual times in recent history with the pandemic? Is there some kind of lesson to take away from that now for us?
Nothing new. I mean, Henry Beecher in the 1950s was really the first person to demonstrate the placebo effect in the context of clinical trials, which is why we now do things like double-blind trials, why you have to.
Mm-hmm.
If you just give everybody, it's like, hey, this might work, take it. We think it'll be great. The response you get will not be based solely on the chemical effectiveness of what you're getting. So if you want, and our modern medical system, biomedicine, is very much biased towards, we want a chemical that works. Ideally, we'd like to understand how it works, although that's not the case perhaps as often as patients maybe think it is. But we want statistical proof that this works completely independently of anything going on in the patient's brain. And we have to be careful with that. Now, trying to leave the patient's brain totally out of the equation doesn't work either. I mean, there are very few instances outside of people who are comatose where you administer a medicine that the patient doesn't know that he or she's getting. And that knowledge can be part of the treatment. So no, I mean, we already know how to build trials to mute the placebo effect to answer our questions. But again, don't leave the mental aspect out of it. It's fascinating. I loved doing this research. I went down a rabbit hole on this that I never expected to be looking at. And it's been, I mean, it completely changed how I looked at the medical text. And I talked about that when I read my paper, but it also really changes how I see modern medicine as well.
Did you may have already mentioned this, but what's the earliest source that you worked with?
These are 10th and 11th century manuscripts.
Okay.
Now, when you're dealing with the Middle Ages, that's a little fraught because manuscripts copy other manuscripts.
Oh.
So the book we have is from 970, but we're pretty sure the thing that it copied was written 100 or 200 years earlier. We think that both these date from about 900, maybe even 800.
Wow.
So yeah, and as I said, these are the oldest vernacular medical texts in the Western tradition. England's awesome. Nobody wrote stuff in the vernacular like the English did. The English had law codes and medical treatises and literature in the vernacular centuries before anyone else in Europe was doing it.
I found it very interesting, Rebecca. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
And I'm one of these who would rather do natural medicines than the ones that they advertise and, you know, give you all these things that are going to happen to you short of dying. And, you know, a lot of my friends also take a lot of, you know, natural kinds of things. So anything that I can do for myself with the doctor that will help me be better with my, you know, my readings and statistics and stuff like that, I'm all for it. So that was very interesting.
And that is a major part of the conversation in placebo studies, which is now an accepted study area, is that our insistence on rigorously testing for chemical provable efficacy probably took us too far away from more holistic, as you say, more natural approaches. And there are reasons for that. placebo responses and chemical responses from plants tend not to work as fast as a pill. I mean, a lot of indigenous medicine to, North America, to Asia, Africa, all these indigenous cultures have their plant-based medicines, many of which are based on demonstrable chemical therapeutic properties of the plants, but it's not going to be as fast. And we want it fast. If we have a headache or, heaven forbid, our child has a headache, we want to fix that baby right away. So that, I think, maybe our impatience is part of why we've moved away from that as well. I want to fix my baby right away. I mean, I get it.
Right.
Joe posted a couple of comments in the chat also about the nature of current vaccine and placebo. So interesting comments too.
I don't know if participants in trials ever find out if they got a placebo or the chemical. I don't know if that is routinely part of the trial. I'm not in the medical school, obviously. I'm an English professor. So, hi there. That would be a question I'd love to hear some of our osteopaths weigh in on. So Joe, I don't know if you'll find that out, but if you do, would you tell us? Oh, great.
Okay. So it sounds like they will find out in this particular trial. Well, thank you so much. Are there any other questions or comments that anyone wants to share? We definitely appreciate everybody's participation, and Dr. Brackman, your research. Is there anything else that you want to comment about how people can read any of your work or find more about this if they are interested in learning more?
I wish I could. It has been under submission at a journal since early spring, and humanities tend to be kind of slow in the peer review process. And of course, the pandemic just blew up everything. So I'm still waiting back to hear, but I hope it will be in print at some point, somewhere.
Well, everybody check libraries, Amazon, wherever in future months, right? And eventually we'll read more about this. So, okay.
Thank you, Frank, and thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Enjoy homecoming.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. All right.